Okay, why don't we go ahead and start? Please.
Andy Bertram, here. Dan Cater.
Here.
Scott Gergen.
Here.
Lisa Dean.
Here.
Russ Roloff.
Here.
Vince O'Brien.
Here.
Joe Becker.
Here.
Superintendent Collins.
Here.
And we have a motion to approve the agenda.
So
With-
moved.
With the caveat that we'll be closing it at the end to discuss some personnel issues.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Motion to approve the minutes of the September 21st board meeting?
I'll motion.
A second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. A motion to approve the bills payable?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion to approve charitable contributions for the first quarter of the school year.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion on that?
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Big thank you to all the,
Big thank you.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Motion to accept the quarterly review of student activities.
All motion. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. And without too much further ado, we'll let Tim have the superintendent's report.
And I start out with a bang right away with our audit report. And many of you know Aaron, the veteran board members for sure know Aaron. He's been with us, well, as long as I've been here, so that's been 14 years. But he's here to report on financial status and management of the district. So Aaron, welcome.
Do you want us to walk through that?
Sure, or do you want me just to cue you in to
Either
just
one.
click it to move forward?
Oh, sorry.
All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. Just close this one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're here tonight to present the results of our audit for the year ended June 30th, 2016. So hopefully we're already there already. So I'll get right down to it to go through the slides that I presented to you. There shouldn't be any surprises in our slides. I pulled them directly from our management report. So we received our financial statement, the student activity report, the management report. And then there's a separate document, the corrective action plan. It's really nothing new from the prior years, just a presentation that was asked with the single audit reporting that we pulled apart from the financial documents. So it's the same format that we've had in the past, just now we're presenting us separately. So it appears you have more documents, but it's the same information you've received in the past. I'll get right to it with the auditor's role to share with you the opinion as an independent auditor to the school district, our opinion on the financial statements, the district audit, as well as the separate student activities audit. Then we have our report on the internal controls and compliance with regard to an audit under government auditing standards, as well as your requirement with the single audit, because you receive in excess of the now $750,000 threshold for federal awards. If you receive in excess of that or expand in excess of that, you are required to do additional testing. And then Office of the State Auditors, state laws and regulations for their Office of the State Auditor legal compliance manual. And then the manual for activity fund accounting for your student activity accounts that are a separate audit. The results of our audit, we've issued what is known as an unmodified opinion. It's exactly what you're looking for when we talk about opinions we can issue. So an unmodified opinion, meaning your financial statements are fairly presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. With regard to the district audit, we had just one finding, as we've noted here, with regard to requirements now that are new for this uniform guidance. So the single audit underwent a significant change this year in requirements and changes in how we approach that audit. And this is not an uncommon finding that we're having this year as we're going through our audit season of making sure clients and districts have written controls over the specific areas we've noted here: cash management, allowable costs, and the various financial management standards. So You may recall we had one finding last year in the federal awards audit, and we're pleased to report that that was corrected. So again, so we just had one finding with regard to the single audit this year. The student activity audit, I believe I'm remembering correctly here, we've got the same findings we've had in the past. So we've issued a qualified opinion for the student activity audit, and it's qualified because it's under a cash basis of accounting, but it's as required by the Minnesota Department of Education, the cash receipts and disbursements report, and that's the report we've reviewed is fairly stated, the cash receipts and disbursements for your district for this past year. In terms of internal control and compliance, we've just got the one internal control of the controls in place with regard to making sure all cash receipts and disbursements are included there, and primarily cash receipts. And again, that is not uncommon in some activities just because you're dealing with such small amounts in various locations. And then we have just one compliance finding for timely deposits. And so, not that we found any that were unusual, just how quickly that they're getting deposited into the bank from the point of receipt and into your financial statement reports. This report, just as a reminder, for the audit period we're looking at for 2016, the single largest funding source is the basic formula allowance under general education, which districts received a 2% increase this past year for the audit year that I'm presenting tonight. For the year you're working in 2016-17 school year, you again are approved for a 2% increase, our districts, not just your district, but all districts in the formula allowance. This is a graph we've shown for many years, just a comparison of your unrestricted fund balances in relation to statewide averages. The comment I just noted is that, as you can see, the district has been spending it down for the last several years, but that was as planned with your approved budgets annually, and you can see there's just a slight decrease from 2015 to the 2016 level. And I've got just a couple of graphs on revenues per ADM as well as the expenditures on a per ADM basis. When you look at the revenues, a couple of notes that I had made for the increase over the prior year. This would include the 2% on the formula allowance that we talked about. There was also an increase in special education funding that was recognized this past year that you're seeing come through. And then new to the districts, an entry we're making with their school districts is this pass-through of pension benefits. So the state of Minnesota is making payments directly to the Teachers Retirement Association. And we're making a journal entry, requiring districts to book a journal entry, grossing up their state revenues and their benefit expenses, representing kind of that proportion that's yours that the state of Minnesota is funding directly. So my business managers haven't been real happy because it's throwing off their budgets and just grossing up a revenue and expense, but it did have a bottom line impact of nothing to your financial statements. On the expenditure side here, we show it again on the per ADM basis. There was an increase on a per student amount of about $281 per student, or 2.2% over the prior year. Part of this change includes the scheduled salary and benefit increases, but also factoring into that is declining enrollment. So where you have flat expenditures, maybe for debt service that are scheduled, if your enrollment's declining, it's just pushing that, forcing that per ADM amount to increase as well. So that does come into play on both the revenues and the expenditures. The next several slides are just looking at the general fund, so the financial position over the past 10 years. The yellow bar being the unrestricted fund balance, so this does not include any fund balances that are restricted, for instance, like operating capital reserves restrictions. As you can see, it's not quite as easy to see, but you are seeing a decrease in that unrestricted bar the last few years, consistent with that decrease that you saw earlier on the statewide graph. But again, as you plan with your approved budgets and to utilize available fund balance. But just a reminder, you can see the cash bar that's kind of gone up and then down, dip back, and now we're up to a kind of a return level where we were in 2009. And That's largely due to the impact of how the state had used the tax shift to balance the budget for a while there, and then the metering of aid payments to school districts was changed. I think 2012, as you can see, was the low point for your district on that cash bar, and they were almost to a 60-40 payment schedule, and now we're back to that 90-10 payment schedule. So, but really that didn't have an impact on revenue, it was just a cash flow item. This table here is providing kind of a breakdown of the components of the general funds fund balance. Like we talked about, the unrestricted would capture those committed, assigned, and unassigned categories that you have. The non-spendable includes dollars that are assets to you, for instance, like prepaid expenses or inventory, but you've already spent the cash, so you can't choose to spend it in another way, so they identify it as a non-spendable portion of the fund balance. And then restricted would capture any restrictions for operating capital or health and safety or any of the other type of state restricted dollars that you receive. And as you can see, there was just a slight change in your unrestricted as well as those unassigned fund balance portions when we compare it to the prior year. Next couple of graphs I have for you share with you your adjusted average daily membership, the resulting pupil units, how they convert, looking at the past 10 fiscal years here for you. The past year, when we look at from 2015 to the year ended June 30th, 2016, the district actually saw a decrease of about 67 ADM, or that average daily membership, which represents about 1.5% of the overall enrollment on an ADM basis. The next graph I have here shows you that percentage change, so you can see that decrease over the past 10 years. The 2015 almost looks like there was a mistake, but if you recall, it was the year they made the change in how formula the student pupil counts were made. So the blue bar is a representative. They haven't changed that over the past 10 years, but there was that one-time blip we'll see where they changed how the pupil counts are converted from average daily membership to pupil units. My next couple graphs, I think, wrap up my general fund discussion. So we've got your general fund revenues, comparison of budget to actual, then to the prior year. You can see we're not having to present any changes for the tax shift, so you're seeing pretty consistent amounts from the prior year. I think what the graph really highlights as well is the concentration of where your funding sources come from to finance the general fund operations. So state sources making up about 74% of your revenues in 2016, and then followed by property taxes making up 19% of your revenues. But overall, there was about a 3.3%. Your revenues were better than anticipated in the budget, and you were about 2.2% over the prior year. And that does include that variance, as I said, for that pass-through of pension funds that came through both on the revenue and the expense side. On the expenditure side, I've got a graph similar to the budget to actual, the prior year presentation, showing it by what's referred to as the object category versus the program category is what we focus on in the financial statement. So just a different presentation slightly, where we're grouping all the salaries, benefits, and again, it shows the concentration where the dollars are spent in the general fund within personnel costs, so salary and benefits. This past year, that made up nearly 80% of the general fund spending, like we see in other districts that we audit, that in order to educate your students, focus there. Your revenues were about your expenditures were 1.6% under budget this past year, and then just 1% over the prior year levels. We have just one graph for the food service and the community service. A couple of the other operating funds. The general fund is by far your largest operating fund, the primary operating fund for the district. We look at just the year-end fund balances for these two separate funds within your financial statements. So you can see the food service fund experienced an increase in fund balance, and the community service fund also experienced an increase this past year, and it isn't going off the page there. I said I wish I would have made this graph just a little bit bigger, but it's like $694,000. It's just so close to the $700,000 there of that year-end fund balance. So Food service fund has an ending fund balance that's representing about 20% of their annual expenditures, and the community service fund is about 29%. This table is, we get better and better as we get some more history for the district, but I thought I'd better start, or I'll never get it added into the financial statement presentation. The district's been self-insured for the health and dental activities for 2 years now. As you can see, we presented here. The fund was established right at the end of 2014, so I just thought to show you that complete picture, and we can roll forward in the future. That's precise with that $6 now for you, so I can get you from the beginning to the end here. But you can see this shows the results of the self-insurance activities for the past basically 2 years and how that has changed. And then my last slide, with the current reporting model that we've had for many years, there's a dual perspective where we look at your individual operating funds on your budgetary basis. That's how I envision you're probably looking at it on a month-to-month basis or with your meetings, how you budget. But you also have to report the full accrual statements where you roll up all the individual funds together, and then we get the long-term perspective of your buildings incorporated into it, and then the long-term obligations. So for instance, you have a debt service fund, and that just focuses on the annual levy to pay your debt service and the debt service expenses. This statement tries to incorporate what do you have outstanding total obligations, bonded obligations, etc. So when we look at your full accrual financial statements and pulling everything together, you can see the district experienced about a 4.37 increase over the prior year, much of which is, it's about split evenly between the restricted categories. So increase in operating capital reserves, and then dollars that you've got restricted for debt service fund have also increased. And then the unrestricted incorporates that financial results of the general fund as well as what we talked about for the internal service fund. So with that, I believe it gets me through the slides that are included here. If there's any questions on any of the documents, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
You guys will never question the validity because you threw a 6 up there on that slide, right?
Wanted to see it right from the beginning, I guess.
Tim, maybe a question for you. The community service special revenue, why have we seen that go from 2014 being at 300,000 to 2016 being almost 700,000? Is that due to pre-K?
Kids Campus is doing quite well. Is that what you would say, Kim? Kids Campus revenue-wise?
And they did do better, yeah.
Yeah. And the same with our food service being a little bit stronger. Part of it is if you look at our staffing and some of the things that we've done even within the last 6 to 9 months, from moving Pam Hoffman out and pairing her up with Missy Williams, so taking that out of the food service budget. Also with some of our veterans, we've had some veteran staff members in the food service retire, resign, or move to other positions, so that's helped our food service as well. But Kim and I met at some point this week, and we looked at some upgrades now with that budget in this coming year, whether it be a serving line at JFK, whether it be, for lack of a better word, some of the smaller items, pots, pans, utensils, of upgrading those materials with that budget now. Again, as you all know, as staff, then we rehire, but then the cost of that budget over time will increase as that staff goes up as well.
To jump ahead and then jump back, should we skip ahead to approve the audit report before?
I wouldn't mind that, so that Aaron can, I don't know if Aaron sits on pins and needles waiting for us to approve it or not, but
I think he wants to get home to his kids.
he probably does want to get home to his kids.
With that, I'll make the motion to accept the audit report.
Second that.
Any discussion?
I just want to share that I thank their firm for putting us on the schedule right away. And again, I've said this before about our Kim Fry and our business office staff, having everything ready so that when Aaron and his staff get here, they know that they can schedule in, they know that they're not going to be wasting their time looking for documents. So I appreciate their firm putting us right on the list so that we can get this report in October. There are some districts, as Aaron knows, they're maybe not getting a report like this till November or December, and it's very tough to plan and look ahead. So double thank you. Thank you to Kim and our staff, and thank you to MMKR for putting us right away here. And we know summer's arrived when their staff shows up, because they're here and it's like, okay, it's time to see how we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Do we approve it, or do we have?
I hopped in on discussion.
First and second, that was discussion.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And Kim, thank you again. Back to the superintendent's report.
The superintendent's report, I really let Jen do the work for me. I have it down that Tim and Jen will present, but it will really be Jen. And this is part of one of the goals that you set for me, but it's also very important for us to look at as a district. And I asked Jen to put together, I didn't give her any real specifics. I just said, look at the areas of socioeconomic status of our students, inclusion, diversity, etc. And what are the gaps that we have in achievement. And I think that anybody who's picked up a newspaper in the last year or two knows that there is an achievement gap, not only in the state of Minnesota, but there's an achievement gap in our nation. And so for her to share some information on where our achievement gaps and where they're, and what we're looking at. Now, are we going to come up with solutions? No, we don't have specific solutions, but it's just to inform you as a board of where our gaps are and how we compare to some other school districts as well. So I thank Jen for putting this together, and I believe that until you look at the problem and recognize you have a problem, you won't do anything until you say, this is where our problem is at. And again, you're going to see as we go through this, we're better than the state average, but that doesn't mean that we still don't have some achievement gaps at Hastings. So with that, thank you, Jen, for doing the bulk of the work under the superintendent's report.
No problem. So I'd like to begin tonight by just sharing from the state perspective. When they look at demographics, they look at these 5 demographic groups, and they call them American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, Black, and White. Those are not Hastings words, those are the state words. It's in the system, so those are the words we're going to use because that's how the state qualifies our groups. So before we begin, and I know that you all had an opportunity to take a peek at the document, which wasn't super short. There were a lot of pages to it, some graphs in there, so that made it easier. I want you to just think about, and let's talk for just a couple of minutes about these questions. So we know that the largest student group population in Hastings is our white group. When you think about that, what do you suppose the percent of our student population, what do you anticipate is the percentage of our white students before you saw the data? Or for those of you who may not have had a chance?
I would have said 85 to 90%.
85 to 90?
About 90+.
Okay. When you think about our second highest student group, what would you guess, or what would you have guessed before you looked?
Hispanic. Was that one of my choices? I don't
Yes.
think they're wrong.
Yep. For most of you would have thought that. All right. How about when you think about the changing demographics, and that's something that phrase is used a lot across the state, across the nation. When you think about our demographics, how do you think they've changed over the past, let's say, decade?
I would have guessed an increase in diversity, but not very much of an increase.
Yeah, tiny change, increase in racial diversity, and then I would have expected growth in free and reduced lunch group.
Okay. Anyone else? I'm using my teacher wait time.
They look impervious to that. What's that about? I'm super susceptible to that.
Okay, we'll move on. When considering those special populations, and that is labeled by the state as our free and reduced lunch, our special ed population, our ELL, when you think about free and reduced lunch, what do you guess our population is?
Percentage-wise?
Mm-hmm.
I would say somewhere in the range of 25%.
Okay. Any other guesses?
15.
15?
I'd go higher.
All right. And how about population or percentage of special ed population? 15? Thanks for putting a guess out there.
Are you defining it with IEPs or?
Yes.
Say 23%.
Okay. All right. So now you have your guesses out there. Let's take a look at what our data says. And you have this in your packet of things, and sometimes it's really hard to see up here. I shared in this graph and the next graph the trend in our demographics. So you'll see at the bottom of the chart 05-06 school year up to last year, the 15-16 school year. And so if we look all the way to the right of that graph, you'll see the percent of diverse students. So back in 05-06, we had just over 7% diverse population, so our white population was just under 93%. And when we look at last year's data, we're at 10.5%, just about there. So, you know, our white population has decreased to just about that 89%. So your guesses and hunches were right on. When thinking about this, I know that you have that. One of the questions that I'm going to ask you after the next chart is, what in this graphic affirmed the suspicions that you had, and what were some surprises? But hold on to that, because I want to get to that special populations. I would have liked to put it all in one chart, but then nobody would have been able to see it. So when we look at our special populations, the state looks at free separate from reduced, but I know that we tend to combine free and reduced lunch, which is the state's way of looking at our students in poverty. So FRP is free and reduced lunch. Combined is that third column, and then the percent is right next to it. If you look to the end, we've got our total students. So in looking at our free and reduced lunch, 05-06, we were hovering at about 17%, and now we're just over 21%. And for special ed, it's been pretty consistent at about 12%. So now to the questions. Looking at that data, what affirmed your thinking and what surprised you?
I actually thought the free and reduced probably would have, of course, I'm closer to it, so I know it year by year, but it's been increasing over time. So I would have assumed that we still would have been on that upward trend. And it looked like it had leveled off or decreased. I mean, it's pretty close, but I figured it would have kept increasing, because that's what we had been doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just surprised by that number overall, by that percentage. It seems like a really, again, to me, that seems like a big percentage.
Of?
For free and reduced lunch.
Mm-hmm.
That really, I knew directionally where it was, but that number still surprises me.
Okay.
Well, when Mark's around, whenever this gets discussed, he points out that in his opinion, he feels that the free and reduced lunch count, when kids enter the middle school, goes down artificially. That the number of people who would qualify for free and reduced lunch programs at the middle school, and presumably higher, don't take advantage of it for social reasons. When I look at everything there on those earlier graphs, and I guess I've been looking at this for a while, and it doesn't really show up there, it's the trend in the lower grades where you see much more significant populations of minority students in Hastings. There was a kindergarten teacher, anecdotally, there was a kindergarten teacher at one of the sites last year that told me that there was 40% minority students in his or her class. And I know from my own son at McCullough that there were at least 3 or 4 cultures present in his kindergarten class. So it's skewed in that the overall number is 10.47% for 15-16 of minority students. But in the lower grades, it's much higher, disproportionately higher.
And I have access to that grade by grade data, so if we want to dig into that, we certainly can, and I can share that with you all, just so that you can see in kindergarten from 05, 06 to here, here's what it looks like, and you can see that grade by grade.
Didn't you find the most surprising thing, though, how amazingly consistent this district is with getting almost exactly 12% special ed every year, going all the way back to however far your data
All
is?
10 years. That would surprise me,
Yeah.
that it just didn't vary by more than 0.5%.
Yeah, you-
Even as the numbers decline.
Well, it makes me ask,
Percentage-wise.
is it really defined on need, or is it defined by capacity that we have for special ed?
I would suggest that our capacity has to fit our need, and that we can't, undocument a student who has needs that are present. We have to test. It's required for us to do that. So I wanted to give you a snapshot of the trend demographics, but really the focus of our work is how does this play out as far as our student success is concerned. One way that we can look at student success is through MCAs. Certainly that isn't the only way we can measure how well our students are doing. A quick snapshot, we want to make sure that we know that MCAs, those Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, happen in grades 3 through 8 and grade 10 in reading, 3 through 8 and grade 11 in math. So when we look at data, MCA data, we aren't capturing our K-1-2 folks, we aren't capturing our seniors, and depending on reading or math, there's another high school grade level that isn't included in our data. When we did this analysis, we looked at the American Indian, Alaskan Native, our Asian Pacific Islander, our Hispanic, and our Black student groups. And then we also looked at free and reduced price lunch and our students receiving special ed services. So that teeny tiny graph that you have in your packet shows a snapshot from the MDE website. And basically here we're seeing the American Indian, Alaskan Native when it comes to math. I would point out in that information to note, and I'm certainly not going to read all of that, that when we see that downward dip in the red line, we have to take into account, because our student group is such a small group, the fluctuation of a few students in increasing or decreasing can make that line dip or excel significantly. So we saw an increase in 3 students in that testing group, and so those 3 students weren't proficient. That was the change, and that's what caused a big dip because the group is so small. When we take a look at this compared to the state, that's one piece of information, but we also want to take into consideration the student group as compared to our data as a whole. And so the last bullet point in all of that information to note is looking at the student group as it compares to our student population as a whole. And so our American Indian, Alaskan Native students underperformed our district averages by about 20%. I'm going to work my way through, and then we'll pause at the end of math and look for questions, and then we'll move on to reading. When we look at the Asian Pacific Islander, again, we outperformed the state. We saw a dip in the past year, again, because of that small size. The total number of student groups changes that line. This past year, our Asian Pacific Islander population performed at about the same as our total population. So we don't see an achievement gap in our district between this student group and our total population. That's pretty consistent with the state. For our Hispanic population, we outperformed the state. We've stayed fairly consistent over the past several years, and our Hispanic population underperformed the district averages by just shy of 15%. So there's a gap of about 15% between our Latino students and our whole student group in math. And then our Black student group saw an increase in about 8%, and we continue to underperform the district averages by just over 17%. So that's the gap that we see, and even though we saw an increase in that cohort scores, we still underperform our entire student population. When we look at free and reduced lunch, and we saw earlier that it's just over 21% of our student population, we continue to outperform the state over the past 3 years, but our gap between the free and reduced lunch students and our total population is 19%, which is a pretty significant gap. And then finally, special ed. And this, I say in here that it's an unfair comparison to look at our special ed students as compared to our total student population, because our students who have IEPs need IEPs because they need support in order to meet that, the grade level expectations. While it's not equitable to look at special ed versus regular ed, the unfortunate thing and what makes our special ed population our greatest opportunity for growth is when we compare special ed in Hastings to special ed at the state, we're underperforming the state. And that's not something we want to see. And so we're continuing to have conversations about how do we not only lean on our special ed teachers to support our kiddos, but look at how do our regular ed teachers, because they're all our kids, we need to do work in both areas. So when we think about, before I go on here, so when we think about math, what questions might you have or what thoughts do you want to share?
Jen, do you know what I don't know, you may have it on the graph, but what's the state average for percentage of IEPs?
I don't have that.
I think it is around 14%,
Okay.
because we're at around 11.7 or 12, if I remember right.
Yeah.
I don't quote, I just,
Where I'm going with that is if we would magically deviate from our 12% special ed and get up to 15% some year, we might start outperforming the state special ed group.
So if we're identifying some higher end students with IEPs, is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. That's just.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did say to Jen, when we looked, when Jen and I gave this a quick review, I said, you know, when you look at your student special ed population, what percentage of them are LD? What percentage of them are EBD? You know, and so we may, if we would break it down into those categories, we might have a higher percentage of students in there. Let's say we have less students that are in LD. We're probably going to perform more poorly than other schools if they have a higher percentage of LD students. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that was one thing I said to Jen, that we might want to spend some time breaking that down. I know that if we talked to a lot of our teachers, there's a feel that there's some tougher needs or higher needs students coming into our district than ever before.
That would be kind of my hunch, and it would go along. You're right, we should break down those numbers because it could, you know, give us the answer as to why we're seeing this statistic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Since you asked how we feel about this,
Yes.
I'm always offended by a comparison to state proficiency. And I think our goal should be to achieve with all populations maximum proficiency, what we deem to be maximum proficiency, regardless of the state. So, yet we're stuck with data, or we're blessed with data, whatever you want to say. And there's ways to break down data, to find cohorts of proficiency broken down into segments of curriculum and what area, and also by grade.
Mhm.
So these are overall.
Yes.
Are there specific, when you break it down, I'm sure you've looked or somebody else has looked, particularly with regards to, well, I guess every category, is there anything striking when you break it down to areas of curriculum or grade level that are particularly good in our district or particularly not good?
When we look at math, and in the course of our curriculum review last year, and we're going to continue working this year, we recognize that number sense or numbers in operations is our greatest opportunity for growth. And that's something that there's been a shift, and we're going to continue that shift to work more on how do we help our kiddos understand why the math works, rather than here are the steps that you do in order to make sure you get the right answer. We want that procedural fluency, but we have to have students understand why those procedures work. When we do that, and we're solid with every kid across the board, we're going to see a increase across our demographics, because that's the one area when we look K-8, even though number sense is not a strand in high school testing, if students don't have strong number sense, then we're not going to see them successful in the other strands. But that, when we looked across the board, was the area for growth. One of the strengths that we have is geometry, particularly in the upper elementary. That shapes thing we do well. And so we're trying to look at, if this is an area of strength, what do we do here that we want to make sure we replicate with those other strand areas?
Cool.
Mhm.
It's when you say that, it's kind of, when you're saying that that was offensive to, compared to the state, are you saying that because it starts to feel like that's somehow our goal rather than just an analytical tool?
If our goal is to be at, is to take the red line and get it to slightly above the green line, I find that absurd.
Right.
Our goal should be to take every group of
But-
students, regardless of minority background, free and
Right.
reduced lunch, economic status, and minority background or sexual identity, and give them the environment and the curriculum and the teaching for them to perform at their highest level. But we again and again and again and again and again, because of some of the state and governmental assessments, we use this as a tool, and all too often, we wind up focusing at that narrow band between, and for the general population, it's around the 65 to 75% proficiency. But for the minority groups and smaller subgroups, it's much lower. So I think, and Jen's doing this, and that's what I would love us to focus on.
Well, and we're going to later, we'll take a look at some comparisons that are beyond the state, because we know that the state may be a floor, and we want to go beyond that and not just look at, hey, let's outperform the state, but let's look at who are our comparable demographics and work to do that as well. Mhm.
So to Vince's point, sorry, Andrew.
Oh, sorry.
Agree. I'm with you as far as I'd love to see it by grade, to see if there's, if we're all kind of on the same playing field, hit a certain grade, and then things start to skew one way or the other. But to Vince's point too, I'm with him in the fact that, what we're talking about, one area we talk about now, well, we obviously need to focus on special ed, how do we get it, because it's our lowest performing group, but at the same time, we shouldn't ignore the rest because we're just here and we're a little bit above. I mean, we should really be focusing, okay, we're here, how do we get here? I mean, who cares that we're outperforming the state, but at what point is it going to be enough? And I would argue that, well, we should always consistently strive to get better at that, not just ignore it because we're not, it's not the problem. So I think we should look at each one. Okay, how do we individually improve each one of these areas? So even if we are 10, 15, 20% higher than the state, how can we keep getting better? And I think that'll help drive kids to the district if we consistently keep outperforming and keep raising that bar.
And as a follow-up, I think more with the area of literacy than math, but are there identifiable cultural barriers with regards to, say, Native American students that have been identified in other educational forums, whether it's Brooklyn Park or Rosemount or Maine, that can help us identify processes and changes. And I don't know about math, but I think in literacy there are things that we can do to help different populations grow. And it's very hard to do that because sometimes the population's so small.
But now, would you both agree that there's real value, though, in looking at this? As long as it doesn't become the goal, is to
Yeah.
make that.
Absolutely.
From a numbers
Okay.
guy, I think it's great.
Well, and
Right,
I think,
okay.
I think the ramifications go much, much farther than this. I think not having minority teachers is an issue, or minority staff becomes an issue. And anybody who's looked at the inability of certain segments of the population to perform at standards that are acceptable in an academic format winds up saying that integration is key to allowing these students to flourish and do better. And unless we can provide an environment where they truly are feeling the ability to be engaged and grow, which I think somewhat involves culture, that it's a hindrance to that, even though it's a small percentage of the population.
Okay, so now we're moving on to literacy, to reading. When we look at our, let me just preface that our scores in math are better than our scores in reading. And we see that across the board in every grade, in every demographic, that we have more work to do in our reading scores than we do in math. Not that we're going to put math on the back burner and say we're going to hold off and not do any work, but we're going to do a both and. So to that point, we started our math curriculum review last year. Literacy finished its review, which ends in purchasing stuff and then implementing the stuff. They are beginning again this year with an eye toward pedagogy and instruction, not about buying new stuff. They have great stuff. Now we need to work at how does that look in the classroom and with our teaching and learning with students. So when we look at reading in our American Indian, Alaskan Native, again, we saw a drop in the past year. Our test group changed and our number proficient decreased. You can, if you look at the tiny little numbers over here, you know, we had 20 students tested last year, 22 tested this year. We went from 12 students proficient to 8. It's a matter of a few kids that change our line significantly. It's important to recognize that a few kids can change our number significantly, and that means we need to be more aware of all of our students. It's certainly not an excuse, but an explanation. We see over 26% gap between this group and the total population in reading. Our Asian Pacific Islander are outperforming the state, and it outperformed our district averages by nearly 6%. When we look at our Hispanic group, this group underperformed our total population by just about 16%. Our Black student group underperformed our district averages by nearly 15%. Our free and reduced lunch underperformed our district by nearly 15%. And our special ed, which is where we have the greatest growth to make, is a significant gap between our special ed and our total population. We expect that gap because our kids who will have IEPs have needs. Again, we are underperforming the state, and that's something that we need to work through. To Vince's point earlier, while it's important to look at our data compared to the state, it's also helpful to look at our comparable groups. And so one of the things that I did over the summer was took a look not only at who do we look like as far as size is concerned, but I looked at each of the demographic groups, free and reduced lunch and special ed, and came up with this list. I think that most of the school districts that we had looked at previously are on here, with an addition of a few who are a little bit bigger than we are, but they look like us as far as percentages. And so I did some work digging and looking at their data compared to our data, and here's what we see. When it comes to math, and the first column is our 2016 data for MCAs, you see that while the state is at 59.5%, we're at 70%, which looks great. We still have some growth to make in order to be at the top of our comparable group, if that's a goal that we have. But it gives us an idea of, here is something that we can look at to not just look at the state as far as how we're doing. And then I've included in here each of the demographic groups, knowing that these districts look like us. So we're not comparing us to a group that has, you know, a whole lot more or a whole lot less in any of those demographic areas. And then when we look at the big picture data for reading, we're not as much of a distance between us and the state, which we'd like to see. And we have some growth to make, and we know that, and that's why we've made the decision to reconvene our literacy group and take a look at the pedagogy and the instruction, so that we can make sure that we're implementing with fidelity the good work with Readers and Writers Workshop, which was a really great thing to happen in our elementary schools a few years back, and we just want to make sure we're doing it the way that it needs to be done in order to help kiddos continue to grow. So what questions do you have, or what thoughts do you have? And do you want one of the previous charts up here as reference?
So where do you go from here? I mean, now we have the data, we see where this is at. And what's the next steps, or what's the game plan?
That's a really great question. The way that I like to approach data is to put it out there. Data only has meaning when we apply the meaning. And what I like to do is to say, what questions does this drive us to ask? And then how do we address those questions? So we can't look at data and say, here's the answer. It's, all right, what does this make me wonder about? And then we have to go do the work to figure out the answers to those questions. And so we did that over the course of this summer. We had a leadership retreat in mid-August where each building invited a group of teachers, and they sat down and sifted through some of their data. We looked at the world's best workforce goals that you all have heard about before, and I'll be back next month to talk about our world's best workforce report. And they, as buildings, designed goals. And then the spin-off from that was during workshop week. That group shared with their staff, here's the work we did in August. Now you need to create goals as PLCs and as individuals. How are you, as a one person in your classroom with your group of kids, going to help us make some movement on our goals? So we've started by really digging into the data and bringing more people on board. It can't be a small group who sifts through the data and owns it. Everybody's got to own it and have some ideas about how to move forward with it.
I think too, some of the things that we do as a district are for all students. We don't necessarily think of them specifically as, okay, you're a free and reduced student or you're Native American. So we, at our work session, for example, we saw Jean Lindbergh and the math. Okay, these are students that are close. What can we do to move them? So in essence, we are working on some of these students and moving them. I just had a proposal from Kyle Latch and JFK Elementary, two fourth grade teachers who targeted services for about 24 students in both reading and math, to go in and say, before school starts from 7:45 to 8:30, 3 days out of the week or 4 days out of the week, we will work with you. And some of it will pre-teach the lesson that's going to be in the classroom today. So again, I think whether that's in the back of the mind of the teacher or the principal when they're doing it, we know that those are some of the things that we're doing as a district to move all students, but also keeping in the back of the mind that if I'm a fourth grade teacher and it's a Native American student, they are part of this demographics that we're looking at.
I get a sense that the staff in the district really appreciates how you're going about coordinating and leading a lot of these things because of the way you communicate respectfully with the teachers and the other staff throughout the district. You know, I sit through staff development, but I also see what you're doing and how you go about doing it. And it's, I think it's very welcome and appreciated. And
Thank you.
people are grateful for that.
Thanks. All right, anything else for me tonight?
Thank you very much. It was a good, very good presentation.
All right, thank you.
What other parts of your student superintendent reports are you going to dish off to other people?
Oh, yeah, Jen, could you stick around and do the first reading of the policy 412? This will be the first reading, so for new board members, this will be the first reading of a policy and some changes, and then at our November board meeting, I'll bring it back, and there'll be a motion item to approve it. Typically what happens is, I won't read through the whole policy, but if after tonight there's a lot of questions, then I'll get together with the policy committee prior to our next board meeting, and I'll say, okay, we heard a lot of questions, let's tease this out a little bit more. A lot of these, what happened with the 412 policy, it was shorter than this. It really at one time focused in on airline purchases, you know, airline tickets, et cetera, airline travel, and as you know, we don't have a lot of that. In fact, very rarely, and it has to be superintendent approved, and it's usually through a grant or an all expense paid trip. So, but a lot of what you'll see in here were things and practices that we were doing outside and that were expectations, and they weren't part of a policy, and so now they're part of this policy. I'm not going to go through all of it, but for example, mileage reimbursement number 3, that's just been a practice that any staff, whether you're a principal, superintendent, teacher, you need to turn in your mileage. You need to do a map quest. So if Tim Collins goes to a meeting at sea, I put in where the meeting was at, I do a map quest, I attach that map quest so the miles are right there so it can't be argued, and then it's paid for according to federal guidelines. And then again, it outlined travel is not from your home to the destination, et cetera. Expense reimbursement, again, it just gives some out-of-state travel. You see that if there's any out-of-state travel, it must be pre-approved by me in advance. And then with anything else, any other meetings, it has to go through the supervisory order that a principal or the staff development committee has to approve it. Again, airline travel, let's just pass over that because that happens like once every 10 years. Personal vehicle, again, just outlining that if possible, if we have 3 principals that would be going to a school law conference, that we'd like them to ride together or to use our school van, et cetera, and just puts that in a formal policy. Again, the accommodations moving forward. The meals is probably the biggest one. And again, when we looked at this policy, we took a lot of it from 196, so we pulled their policy because if they have an attorney on staff and they have it all written out rather than us recreating it all, and so for part of it, it was what do we believe should be a dollar value, and I guess that's the biggest thing for you as a board. That, you know, for lunch, for dinner, for breakfast, you know, when it gets into gratuity, et cetera. And then again, I would say that 96% of the time, there aren't meals purchased outside. It's typically, so if you know, Vince is doing a school law conference on November 11th or 12th, part of your payment for the conference is the wonderful box lunch that Vince arranges. So 99 out of 100 times, this doesn't come into play because it's part of the cost of the conference. But again, It does outline alcoholic beverages. You would think that you don't have to outline that, and we don't have to, but you still put it in there in case it would happen. The P card, and how you would have to go about reimbursement if you did go through this process. Then the other cost, if Tim Collins goes to a conference and I decide to go golfing at that conference, I can't turn in my golf cart and the round of golf. Again, you don't think that you should have to say it, but we toss it in here to make sure that Tim Collins knows that he can't do that.
Can't pay for your drinks either.
No, yeah. So again, transportation, very seldom. We hardly ever go to out-of-state travel, so this is just in case. It's us as a board outlining the parameters.
Oh, thank you.
And then item I, we added this, we've talked about this, about Tim Collins gets offered an all-expense paid conference. I think Jen and Mary last year had an all-expense paid conference. So by law, I can't accept anything above $5. The board can accept the conference and say that they want to send Tim Collins to it. The board can accept a conference and say, I would like to send Mike Johnson to that conference. So that's, again, something that we've been in practice and that we have been doing. So again, if any of you, after reading it, if you'd have any great questions about it or specific questions, send them my way. And if I'd see that there'd be one or two specific questions, then I'd pull the policy committee together before our November board meeting, and we'd talk about it, tease it out, and then we'd look to readdress it before we accept the policy.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Most of our policies are slightly modified or unmodified from stuff we get from the MSBA, and this one is not. Right, I mean, so my question would be why, I guess?
Because,
What we had was MSBA.
Yep.
Didn't include.
yeah, what we had was MSBA.
So this is just better?
Is better.
Okay.
And it, as we looked at different policies in this area, it sometimes fits the philosophy of the board as well. You know, so at first when I saw the out-of-state travel and the airline and the baggage and the car rental, I said to Kim, well, we don't need to have that in. We don't do that here. Why would I even have that in there? We hardly ever travel out of state, if ever. Well, it's still good to have it because that one time when it does happen, then the parameters are set and everybody knows it. So I'd say kind of massaging the district's needs.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, again, if you do have more specific questions as you take more time to look at it, do it within the next week, and then I'll pull the policy committee together. I think the only area of question might be the dollar amount that we selected for breakfast, lunch, and supper. You might have questions on that. Again, we took that off of 196's policy, and as I said, 95% of the time when we go to a conference, the box lunch is part of the conference fee.
This might be the most non-controversial policy.
Yeah.
Number 2 on the agenda, motion to approve 2 leaves.
I'll approve.
Second?
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. And 2 resignations.
I'll make the motion to accept the resignations.
We can second.
Any discussion?
I just want to share 2 things. Thank you to April Beckel, who is still in the area. And even though she's resigned her position as Director of Food Service, she's still coming in at 6 o'clock in the morning till 7:30 prior to going to her other job, and then coming back as well. And it's really been helping us in the transition. And again, as Kim's been leading that interview process, And I can't share who or the name, et cetera, but we had some outstanding applicants, and just a day ago, we did get acceptance from an outstanding candidate, so I'm very thankful for that. And again, April, through working with Kim, yes, I'll come and I'll help with the transition. I'll set up a 4-hour meeting with this person. I'll come and do whatever I can to make sure that Hastings is successful as we continue to move forward. So very appreciative of that.
That's great news. Motion's been made, second's been made. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. And a motion to approve some new hires.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Oh, do you want to?
Nope.
No? Okay. Motion passes. And we have 3 dates coming up.
Yeah, our work session will be, our next work session is at Pinecrest Elementary. And student luncheon, again, is on Tuesday. They start, it's a change for our more veteran board members. We do start around 11:30 and go till about 12:30. And then our regular board meeting on the 30th.
And then we need a motion to close for negotiations.
A motion.
Second.
Any discussion on that? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
And we can go right next door. Take about 15 minutes.
Tim, are we gonna do a